Hello. I'm now going to go through the documentation I made for my solution of the real-time embedded systems Synchronome project. And this is an exercise in designing a real-time embedded system, and it's part of a course that's offered by the University of Colorado Boulder through the online learning platform Coursera. The whole project is online on GitHub, including documentation about the precise requirements of the course, as well as the solution I've come up with. The system is required to record images through a camera that's pointed at a ticking clock. And there should be exactly one frame recorded for every stationary unique position of the hands of the external clock. That implies that the system needs to know when the ticks of the external clock are happening, and it will then need to pick exactly one frame in between every 2 ticks of the external clock. And the selected frames are then saved to storage. For the advanced goals of the course, this is required to work also in case of the external clock being a stopwatch running at 10 Hz. For example, a stopwatch with a 1/10 of a second hand, or a stopwatch with a digital display and a 1/10 of a second digit. Additionally, to get full credit, the system should support some kind of additional processing applied to the selected images. And my solution uses the Raspberry Pi Model 4B and the C270 HD webcam. And the software runs on Linux as an operating system and makes use of several advanced features such as real-time threads to realize prioritized preemptive scheduling, as well as thread affinities to emulate asymmetric multiprocessing. The software is written in C and uses the video for Linux driver as a layer between the camera and the software. The functionality is split into several services which are connected through message queues, and this realizes a design that realizes a chain of responsibilities that represent the several stages of processing of the images. And the first service is frame acquisition. This will simply acquire frames from the camera and attach timestamps on them of the time when the images have been taken. And this service is triggered by a software timer interrupt in regular small intervals. The next stage is frame selection, which will, from the stream of incoming frames, have to select images according to the criteria that I've already explained. And finally, the selected images need to be converted into the RGB format and stored to the file system. That's the two remaining services. The interesting part to understand is the frame selection process. And let's for a second, to understand this, let's for a second assume that the frame acquisition rate is a multiple of the frequency of the ticking clock. For example, let's say we have 3 frames for every single tick of the external clock. And if that's the case, that means when we have the right reference point, the frame selection could work by simply assuming that every 3rd frame is a tick frame, and that's what's shown here. And it will then have to so the tick frames are the ones that are probably blurred and should not be taken. So it can then select one of the 2 frames in between the tick frames. And this mode of operation could be called running on internal tick, by which I mean making decisions solely based on the numbering of frames. And it can also be called stubborn mode, because it completely ignores the content of the frames or doesn't take into account any kind of actual tick detection. But of course, this does not suffice, because the assumption that the frame acquisition is a multiple of the frequency of the clock is an estimation, and in fact the internal tick might slowly drift against the external ticking clock, which is why the frame selection process actually has to take into account the content of the frames captured, and the way this works is it applies a simple motion recognition technique that's based on taking the sum of pixel-wise differences between adjacent frames, and if that value exceeds a certain threshold, this will then be considered a tick of the external clock. So that's the alternative scenario, basing the frame selection on actual tick detection based on motion recognition. But the issue with that is that tick detection is sometimes not completely stable. That has to do with the issue of finding the right thresholds. And in rare situations, it happens that sometimes tick detection might not work, and it might occasionally miss ticks or recognize additional ticks that are not there. And this also would break the whole system, because it makes the frame selection go unreliable and sometimes pick additional frames or miss frames that should have been picked. And the solution I've implemented is taking into account both kinds of information. So it will take into account the internal tick based on numbering of frames, as well as tick detection based on motion recognition. And the solution is what I call a tick parser, and what it does is it will try to match detected ticks with internal ticks, and this way it will also be able to recognize whenever the internal ticks are lagging behind the detected ticks, and if that happens several times, it can adjust the frame numbering in order to counteract drift and synchronize the system. This also happens when the internal tick runs ahead of the external tick. And if that happens several times, it will also adjust the frame numbering to counteract this drift. Additionally, the system is now possible to be made robust against occasional errors in tick detection, and that works by the tick parser noticing if the one-to-one correspondence between internal and external ticks break, and whenever that is the case, it can simply go back into stubborn mode, ignore tick detection information, and simply run on internal ticks and simply base the decisions on the numbering of frames. But as soon as tick detection becomes online and stable again, it will immediately take into account both informations and in order to synchronize with the external tick. A real-time system is a system where services have to meet certain deadline constraints in order for the system to work properly. And therefore I should prove that the services in this system always meet their deadlines under all circumstances. And the deadlines are actually simply the same as the intervals at which each service is being run. And the interval follows from the requirements and the system design. For example, service 1 and 2 are successively, repeatedly executed at a frame acquisition interval. And in order for the frame selection to have enough options, the frame acquisition interval should be 1/3 of the tick interval of the external clock. Service 3 and 4 operate on the selected frames, and there's exactly one frame selected for each tick of the external clock. That means that on average their repetition interval is the clock tick interval. Each service during runtime monitors their own execution time for each iteration and writes them into the system log files. And from these timing information, I have generated these plot diagrams, and we can see here that for the frame acquisition service, the execution time is about 33 milliseconds, which makes sense because the maximum frame rate that the camera supports is 30 frames per second. So this shows that the system will be able to run successfully even on the external clock running at 10 Hertz, because in this case the frame acquisition has to be 33 milliseconds. The Raspberry Pi has a CPU with 4 cores, and Service 1 and Service 4 run on their own separate core, but Service 2 and 3 share the same core. occupy the same core. And this means, in order to show that both services are always able to meet their deadlines, I have to refer to rate monotonic theory, which goes back to a paper written by Liu and Leyland. And the theory states that multiple services can be successfully scheduled and always are able to meet their deadlines under the rate monotonic policy. That is a service should be prioritized whenever it has higher frequency. So higher frequency services go first. And the scheduling policy should adhere to prioritized preemptive scheduling. So the theory says that this is always feasible as long as the total utilization on the CPU is below a certain least upper bound. And for two services, this least upper bound is given as 83%. I can't go into details here, but it should suffice to say that if I'm able to prove that both services, so that the total utilization with these two services is below this least upper bound, then it should be feasible for them to always meet their deadlines. And if we assume that the execution time for service 2 and 3 is 10 milliseconds, we can then compute the utilization on core 3 such as follows. The utilization is the execution time divided by the period at which the service is run. And if we assume 10 milliseconds execution time, then the utilization for service 2 is 10 milliseconds divided by a third of a second, and that's 3% utilization for service 2. For service 3, we have 10 milliseconds divided by 1 second, because that's the interval for service 3 is 1 second, and that's 1%. So the total utilization is the sum of both utilizations. That's 4% total utilization, and we can see that the total utilization is below the least upper bound given by Liu and Leyland, and this shows that in the standard scenario, scheduling of service 2 and 3 is feasible, even though it's that both services are running on the same core. For the stretch goal, we have the total utilization for service 2 and 3 accounts to 40%. That's 10 times higher, but this is still way below the least upper bound. So in both cases, scheduling is still feasible. Service 4 is special in that it's not being considered a real-time thread, but is simply run in a best effort kind of way. And I've plotted I should probably first show the execution time for the two services I've now discussed. That's service 2 and 3. And it's important to say that the worst case execution time is below the assumption I made. It's for service 2, this is about 7 milliseconds, and my assumption was 10 milliseconds. For service 3, we have a worst case execution time of around 3 milliseconds, or 3.5, and that's also below 10 milliseconds. So scheduling is safe, and my assumption was correct. Service 4 is the write to storage service, and it's run in a best effort way run in the best effort kind of manner. And the plot shows the execution time measured during actual runtime. You can see that there are occasional spikes in the file system operations execution time, and sometimes it even goes above 1 second for one single write operation. And my theory is that this is because the operating system actually buffers write operations and only occasionally synchronizes these write operations to persistent storage, and that's why occasionally one single write operation takes so long. That's the times when the operating system synchronizes pending write operations to storage. It's therefore very decisive for the storage thread to be decoupled from the other services through this input queue, and the input queue should be able to grow large enough such that whenever we have these peaks in write operation execution time, this is not being able to block the other services, but will simply result in the input queue to grow a little bigger occasionally. And then additionally to the arguments given here, there's an additional measure taken to prove that the services always meet their deadlines. And the way this is done is during execution, each service will monitor their own runtime and plot them to system log files, but additionally it will also, whenever it misses the deadline specified for this service, this will be considered a fatal error, and this will immediately make the program fail with a non-zero exit code. So that gives additional proof that the system under all circumstances can be considered a hard real-time system, and a successful run of the program is always proof that every service has met their deadlines. In conclusion, the system has been shown to run successfully in case of the external clock being an analog clock running at 1 Hertz. And additionally, it has been shown to run successful for the external clock in case of the external clock being a stopwatch with a digital display and a 1/10 of a second digit. So that's the case of the external clock being running at a tick of 10 Hertz. The results or the main observations are that, of course, for such kinds of a system, the file system access is actually the bottleneck. That's because writing into flash file system of flash storage is basically really slow. And my personal learning is that also this applies for writing into the system log files. So it's decisive to decouple all kinds of file system access from the real-time services. And otherwise, so in case of the system log files, this results in occasionally the services being blocked in logging operations, whenever the file system is already occupied, and this will make the services miss their deadlines, which is why even system logging has to be decoupled into a separate thread. And otherwise, yeah, missed deadlines in real-time services are of course catastrophic. Well, thank you for your attention.